The African wilderness operates according to rules that have remained essentially unchanged for millions of years, a harsh but balanced system where every creature knows its place in the complex hierarchy of survival. At the very top of this hierarchy sits the lion, an apex predator that fears virtually nothing in its natural environment. These magnificent cats are built for dominance, possessing the strength to bring down prey many times their size, the courage to defend their territory against any challenger, and the confidence that comes from being the undisputed rulers of their domain. A pride of lions moves through the savanna with an air of absolute authority, their very presence enough to send other animals fleeing in panic. They fear neither the darkness of night, which they use to their advantage during hunts, nor the confined spaces of caves and rocky outcrops, which they often use as shelter from the brutal midday sun. Yet there are moments, rare and unsettling, when even these fearless predators encounter something that triggers deep instinctive dread, something that makes them refuse to go forward despite their natural boldness. This is the story of one such encounter, an incident that took place in the Tsavo National Park in Kenya, one of Africa's largest and oldest protected wilderness areas. Tsavo has a reputation among wildlife experts as a place where the unusual becomes commonplace, where the vast landscapes and diverse ecosystems create conditions for remarkable animal behavior and unexpected encounters. The park is famous for its red elephants, colored by the iron-rich soil they bathe in, and for its dramatic history, including the infamous man-eating lions that terrorized railway workers in the late 19th century. But beyond these well-known features, Tsavo holds countless secrets in its remote corners, places where few humans venture and where nature reveals itself in ways both beautiful and terrifying. It was in one of these remote areas that a pride of lions would confront something so disturbing that their reaction would puzzle experienced rangers and wildlife researchers for years to come. The story begins with a team of wildlife rangers conducting a routine patrol through a particularly isolated section of the park. This area was characterized by rocky terrain interspersed with dry riverbeds and scattered vegetation, a landscape that provided excellent hunting grounds for predators and abundant hiding places for prey. The patrol team, led by a veteran ranger named Joseph Mwangangi, had been tracking a pride of lions that had been reported near the park's western boundary. Joseph had worked in Tsavo for over 20 years, and his knowledge of the park's wildlife was encyclopedic. He could identify individual lions by their scars and mane patterns, predict their movements based on seasonal changes, and read the subtle signs in the landscape that told stories of recent animal activity. On this particular day, he and his team were following fresh lion tracks that led them deeper into an area of the park they rarely visited. The tracks were clear and recent, indicating that the pride had passed through within the last few hours. Joseph counted at least 8 individual lions based on the paw prints, suggesting this was a substantial pride, likely consisting of several adult females, their cubs, and possibly 1 or 2 adult males. The tracks led them through increasingly rugged terrain, winding between large boulders and up rocky slopes that provided challenging footing for their vehicle. Eventually, they reached a point where the vehicle could go no further, and Joseph made the decision to continue on foot, bringing with him 2 other experienced rangers while leaving the rest of the team with the vehicle. They moved cautiously, knowing that tracking lions on foot was inherently dangerous work that required constant vigilance and respect for the animal's capabilities. After approximately 30 minutes of careful tracking, Joseph and his team heard the unmistakable sounds of lions ahead. The vocalizations were unusual, however, not the typical grunts and growls of a pride at rest or the excited sounds of a successful hunt. Instead, they heard agitated roaring, repeated and insistent, mixed with sounds that Joseph had learned to recognize as expressions of distress or confusion. Moving even more carefully now, the rangers crept forward until they reached a vantage point that allowed them to observe the pride without being detected. What they saw was immediately striking in its strangeness. The entire pride, consisting of 3 adult lionesses, 5 adolescent cubs, and 2 young males, was gathered in a semicircle around the entrance to a large cave set into a rocky hillside. Their attention was completely focused on this dark opening, and their behavior was unlike anything Joseph had witnessed in his 2 decades of experience. The lions were clearly agitated, pacing back and forth in front of the cave entrance, occasionally approaching within a few meters before quickly retreating. One of the adult lionesses would periodically roar toward the cave, a sound that echoed back from the dark interior in an eerie fashion. What made the scene so remarkable was the obvious reluctance, even fear, that the lions were displaying. These were powerful predators in the prime of their lives, creatures that should have been confident and bold, yet they were behaving like frightened house cats confronted with something they didn't understand. The younger lions stayed well back from the cave entrance, huddled together and watching the adults anxiously. Even the 2 young males, who would normally be displaying bravado and aggression at every opportunity, seemed subdued and nervous. Joseph signaled his team to remain still and observe. He pulled out his binoculars and studied the scene carefully, trying to understand what could possibly be causing this reaction. The cave entrance was approximately 3 meters wide and perhaps 2 meters high, a dark opening that led back into the hillside at a downward angle. The ground around the entrance showed numerous lion tracks, indicating that the pride had been circling this spot for some time. There were no obvious signs of what might be inside the cave that would provoke such a response. No sounds emerged from the darkness, no movements were visible in the shadows, nothing that would obviously explain the pride's behavior. Yet the lions continued their agitated pacing, clearly wanting to either enter the cave or drive out whatever they perceived to be inside, but equally clearly unable or unwilling to actually venture into that dark space. As the rangers watched, one of the adult lionesses finally seemed to gather her courage. She approached the cave entrance more boldly than before, her body low to the ground in a stalking posture, moving with the slow, deliberate steps of a hunter closing in on prey. She reached the very edge where sunlight met shadow, paused for a long moment, and then took one tentative step into the darkness. Immediately, she froze. Her entire body went rigid, every muscle tensed, and for several seconds she remained absolutely motionless. Then, with sudden explosive movement, she leaped backward out of the cave entrance, landing in the sunlit area outside and immediately retreating several meters further back. Her reaction triggered panic in the rest of the pride. The cubs scattered in different directions. The other adults roared in apparent alarm, and for a moment chaos reigned as the lions responded to whatever threat the lioness had perceived. Joseph felt his own heart rate increase as he watched this unfold. Something inside that cave had frightened an adult lioness badly enough to make her retreat in what appeared to be genuine terror. But what could possibly have that effect on a lion? The most obvious answer would be another large predator, perhaps a leopard that had taken refuge in the cave, or possibly even another lion from a rival pride. However, leopards typically avoided confrontations with lion prides, knowing they would be overwhelmed by superior numbers. And if it were a rival lion, the pride would likely have responded with aggressive territorial behavior rather than this fearful reluctance. Joseph considered other possibilities. Could there be a dangerous snake inside, perhaps a black mamba or cobra that the lioness had detected? But lions were generally not afraid of snakes and would typically kill them if they posed a threat. Could the cave be home to a large porcupine whose quills could cause serious injury? Again, this didn't quite fit the observed behavior. As the pride gradually calmed down and reformed their semicircle around the cave entrance, Joseph made a decision. They needed to investigate what was inside that cave. Not only was this an opportunity to understand what could frighten a pride of lions so thoroughly, but there was also a practical consideration. If there was something dangerous in that cave, something unusual enough to elicit this reaction, it might represent a threat to park visitors or other wildlife that needed to be identified and managed. He radioed back to the rest of his team, explaining the situation and requesting additional equipment, including powerful flashlights, safety gear, and backup personnel. While they waited for reinforcements to arrive, Joseph and his team continued observing the pride, documenting their behavior and noting every detail of the interaction. Over the next hour, the pattern repeated several times. One of the lions would approach the cave entrance with apparent determination, sometimes managing to take a few steps into the darkness before suddenly retreating as if encountering an invisible barrier. The reactions were consistent across different individuals, suggesting that whatever was inside the cave was producing a response that wasn't just random fear, but something specific and powerful enough to overcome the lion's natural courage and curiosity. Joseph noticed that the lions seemed particularly sensitive to whatever was emanating from the cave when the wind shifted to blow from the cave entrance toward them. This observation suggested that scent might be playing a crucial role in their reaction. Lions have an extremely sophisticated sense of smell, capable of detecting prey, rivals, and threats from great distances. If something inside the cave was producing an odor that triggered deep instinctive fear in the lions, that would explain their behavior. When the reinforcement team arrived with additional equipment and personnel, Joseph briefed them on what they had observed. The group discussed various theories and approaches, ultimately deciding that the safest course of action would be to wait until the pride moved away from the immediate area before attempting to investigate the cave. They didn't want to stress the lions unnecessarily or risk a confrontation that could be dangerous for both the animals and the rangers. As the afternoon wore on and the heat intensified, the pride gradually began to lose interest in the cave. The lionesses led the cubs away to find shade and rest, though Joseph noted that they didn't go far, settling down approximately 100 meters from the cave entrance in a position where they could still watch it. The two young males remained near the cave for a while longer, occasionally approaching and retreating, before finally joining the rest of the pride. With the lions at a safe distance, but still visible, Joseph and 3 other rangers began their approach to the cave. They moved slowly and deliberately, constantly checking the pride's position to ensure they weren't triggering any aggressive response. As they drew closer to the cave entrance, Joseph noticed a subtle but distinct odor in the air. It wasn't immediately identifiable, but it had an unusual quality, slightly sweet, yet also acrid, unlike anything he had encountered before in the park. The other rangers noticed it too, commenting on how strange it smelled. When they reached the cave entrance, they paused to prepare their equipment, checking flashlights and ensuring they had clear communication with the team members who remained at a distance with the vehicle. Joseph took the lead, turning on his powerful spotlight and directing its beam into the cave's interior. The light revealed a passage that extended back into the hillside, the floor sloping downward at a moderate angle. The walls were rough volcanic rock, typical of this region, with numerous small crevices and irregularities. Nothing immediately visible seemed threatening or unusual. Joseph took his first steps into the cave, moving cautiously and sweeping his light back and forth to illuminate every corner and shadow. The other rangers followed close behind, their own lights adding to the illumination. The temperature inside the cave was noticeably cooler than the outside air, and the strange odor became stronger with each step they took deeper into the passage. After advancing approximately 15 meters into the cave, Joseph's light caught something that made him stop abruptly. On the cave floor ahead of them, barely visible in the beam of his flashlight, was what appeared to be a large, irregular shape. As he adjusted his angle and brought the light to bear more directly on the object, its nature became suddenly and horrifyingly clear. It was the partially decomposed body of an elephant, a young one based on its size, probably a juvenile that had been between 5 and 7 years old when it died. The sight was shocking for several reasons. First, it was highly unusual for an elephant to enter a cave at all, as these animals typically avoided confined spaces. Second, the location of the body, deep inside the cave, rather than near the entrance, suggested that the elephant had deliberately moved into this space before dying, rather than having been killed elsewhere and dragged here by predators. As Joseph and his team moved closer to examine the carcass, the mystery deepened further. The elephant's body showed no obvious signs of predation. There were no bite marks, no evidence of feeding by carnivores, no scattering of bones that would indicate scavengers had been working on it. The decomposition appeared to be natural, suggesting the body had been here for perhaps 2 to 3 weeks, based on its condition and the dry cave environment, which would slow decay. But most puzzling of all was the elephant's position. It was lying on its side in what appeared to be a relatively peaceful posture, not sprawled or contorted as an animal dying in distress might be. The rangers examined the surrounding area carefully, their lights revealing something else that added another layer to the mystery. The cave walls near the elephant's body were marked with what appeared to be deliberate scraping, as if the elephant had rubbed against them repeatedly before dying. Joseph felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to come together in his mind, though the complete picture remained elusive. The strange odor in the cave was clearly emanating from the decomposing elephant carcass, intensified by the enclosed space and the chemical processes of decay. This smell was what the lions had been reacting to so strongly. But why would the scent of a dead elephant, which should represent a potential food source, cause such fear and avoidance in a pride of lions? Lions regularly scavenged elephant carcasses when the opportunity arose, though they typically targeted calves or weak individuals and usually only fed on elephants killed by other means, rather than attempting to bring them down themselves. The answer, Joseph realized, might lie not in the elephant being dead, but in how and why it had died. He recalled stories he had heard from other rangers and from local communities about elephants behaving strangely before death, sometimes entering caves or traveling to specific locations as if drawn by some instinct. There were legends about elephant graveyards, mythical places where elephants supposedly went to die, though these had largely been dismissed by scientists as folklore with no basis in observable behavior. However, there were documented cases of elephants displaying unusual behavior when they were sick or dying, sometimes separating from their herds and seeking isolated places. More significantly, there were accounts of elephants that had been poisoned, either accidentally through contaminated water or deliberately by humans, exhibiting specific behaviors including entering confined spaces and scraping against rocks or trees, possibly in an attempt to alleviate discomfort or pain. The possibility that this elephant had been poisoned suddenly made the lion's behavior much more understandable. If the elephant's body contained toxins, either from poisoned water sources or from deliberately placed poison, those toxins would be present in its decomposing flesh. The scent emanating from the carcass would carry chemical signatures of those poisons, and the lions, with their extraordinarily sensitive olfactory systems, would be able to detect them. Throughout their evolutionary history, lions would have learned to avoid food sources that carried certain chemical markers associated with danger, developing instinctive aversion responses to protect themselves from consuming toxic substances. This would explain why the pride showed not curiosity about a potential meal, but fear and avoidance, their instincts warning them away from something that smelled fundamentally wrong and dangerous. Joseph quickly radioed this theory back to park headquarters, emphasizing the urgency of the situation. If his suspicion about poisoning was correct, this represented a serious threat, not just to this one elephant, but potentially to many other animals in the area. Poisoned water sources could kill numerous creatures, and if humans were deliberately using poison in the park, either to kill wildlife for ivory or in misguided attempts to protect livestock in areas bordering the park, it represented both an ecological crisis and a criminal matter that required immediate investigation. The park's veterinary team and anti-poaching unit were mobilized within hours, arriving at the site with equipment to collect samples and conduct field analysis. Dr. Patricia Njeri, the park's senior veterinarian, conducted a thorough examination of the elephant carcass, while her team collected tissue samples for detailed laboratory analysis. Her field assessment supported Joseph's theory. She found indicators consistent with poisoning, including certain patterns of organ degradation, visible even in the decomposed state, and the presence of chemical residues that preliminary tests suggested might be agricultural pesticides. These pesticides, commonly used in farming areas surrounding the park, were sometimes deliberately placed at water sources by individuals seeking to kill elephants in retaliation for crop damage or to harvest ivory. The practice was illegal and horrific, causing immense suffering to the animals and creating cascading effects throughout the ecosystem as poisoned carcasses became death traps for scavengers and predators. The investigation expanded rapidly. Rangers and researchers fanned out across the region, checking water sources and looking for any signs of contamination or tampering. They found 2 additional poisoned waterholes within a 5-kilometer radius of the cave, each showing evidence of deliberate pesticide introduction. Thankfully, they arrived in time to prevent further deaths, immediately cordoning off these areas and beginning decontamination procedures. The anti-poaching unit, working with local police, launched an investigation that eventually led to the arrest of several individuals involved in the poisoning operation. The case received significant media attention, highlighting the ongoing challenges of human-wildlife conflict and the desperate measures some people resort to when they feel their livelihoods are threatened by wildlife. Meanwhile, back at the cave, the pride of lions continued their vigil for several more days. Even after rangers sealed the cave entrance to prevent other animals from entering and being disturbed by the carcass or potentially exposed to any remaining toxins, the lions remained in the area, periodically approaching and investigating. Dr. Njeri explained that the pride had formed a strong association between that specific location and danger, a learned behavior that would likely persist and potentially be transmitted to younger pride members through observation and social learning. This kind of cultural transmission of knowledge, where one generation of animals learns from another to avoid specific threats, was a well-documented phenomenon in many species and represented a crucial survival mechanism. The incident sparked broader discussion among wildlife researchers about the sophistication of predator sensory capabilities and decision-making processes. Dr. Njeri collaborated with animal behavior specialists to write a detailed case study about the lions' response, arguing that their behavior demonstrated a level of chemical discrimination and risk assessment that had been underestimated in previous research. The pride hadn't simply smelled something unpleasant and avoided it. They had detected specific chemical markers in the scent emanating from the cave, evaluated those markers as indicating danger despite the presence of a potential food source, and made a collective decision to stay away. This suggested cognitive processing that went beyond simple stimulus-response patterns and indicated more complex decision-making capabilities than many researchers had attributed to lions. The story of the pride that refused to enter the cave became a teaching case used in wildlife management training programs across Africa. It illustrated several crucial principles. First, it demonstrated that unusual animal behavior often has logical explanations rooted in the animal's sensory capabilities and survival instincts, even when those explanations aren't immediately obvious to human observers. Second, it highlighted the importance of paying attention to what animals are trying to tell us through their behavior. The lion's fearful avoidance of the cave was essentially a warning signal that something was seriously wrong, a message that might have been missed or dismissed, if not for Joseph's experience and willingness to investigate thoroughly. Third, it underscored the cascading consequences of human-wildlife conflict, showing how actions taken in one context could create unexpected and far-reaching problems throughout an ecosystem. For Joseph and his ranger team, the incident reinforced lessons they already knew but sometimes took for granted. Wildlife behavior, no matter how strange it might appear, always has a reason behind it. The key to effective conservation and park management lies in learning to read and interpret these behaviors correctly, understanding that animals are constantly responding to their environment in sophisticated ways that reflect millions of years of evolutionary adaptation. The lion's refusal to enter the cave wasn't cowardice or irrational fear. It was intelligent risk avoidance based on sensory information that their evolutionary history had taught them to respect. The pride itself gradually moved away from the area over the following weeks, resuming their normal patterns of hunting and territorial behavior. However, rangers noted that they continued to avoid the immediate vicinity of that cave for months afterward, giving it a wide berth even when other factors might have drawn them to that area. The younger lions in the pride, who had witnessed their mother's reaction to the cave, showed the same avoidance behavior, demonstrating that the lesson had been learned and would likely persist throughout their lives. They might never understand the specific reason for avoiding that place, but they understood that their elders had deemed it dangerous, and that knowledge alone was sufficient. Years later, long after the cave had been thoroughly cleaned and the immediate threat of poisoning addressed, rangers still occasionally encountered lions in that area. The descendants of the original pride, young lions born long after the incident, showed no particular fear of the cave, suggesting that the avoidance behavior had not become a permanent cultural trait transmitted across generations once the original lions who experienced the threat had died or moved away. This observation provided valuable insight into how animal cultures work, indicating that some learned behaviors persist only as long as individuals with direct experience remain alive to reinforce them, while others become more permanently embedded in group behavior patterns. The elephant whose death had triggered this entire chain of events was eventually given a respectful burial, its remains cremated according to park protocols for handling potentially contaminated carcasses. Dr. Njeri and her team ensured that every precaution was taken to prevent any remaining toxins from entering the ecosystem. The case contributed to broader policy discussions about human-wildlife conflict mitigation, leading to new programs aimed at helping communities living near park boundaries develop alternative strategies for protecting their crops and livestock without resorting to poisoning. Educational campaigns emphasized that poisoned animals didn't simply disappear, but created toxic landscapes that threatened entire food webs, potentially even circling back to harm the humans who had initiated the poisoning through contaminated water or meat. The question posed at the beginning of this story has been answered. What was the pride so afraid of? They feared what their instincts told them to fear, a chemical signature that marked danger, toxins that could kill them if they consumed the contaminated flesh inside that cave. Their sophisticated sensory systems and millions of years of evolutionary wisdom had protected them from a threat that human observers couldn't even detect without specialized equipment. The lion's behavior, which initially seemed like an inexplicable mystery, turned out to be a masterclass in survival instinct and risk assessment. They demonstrated that being an apex predator doesn't mean being reckless or fearless in all situations. True survival intelligence means knowing when to retreat, when to avoid, and when to trust the warning signals that your senses provide, even when you don't fully understand the nature of the threat. The pride's refusal to enter that dark cave wasn't a failure of courage. It was a triumph of instinct, a demonstration of the profound wisdom that nature has encoded into these magnificent creatures. Wisdom that ultimately saved their lives and provided humans with valuable lessons about respect for the natural world and the consequences of our actions within it.